Okay, thank you for coming to our webinar, How Children Understand Race and How Parents Can Help. I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping tips. My name is Margaret Horvath. I work in the Parenting Community Engagement Office. So first of all, what I want to say is to use or view the chat box, press the chat icon that looks like a word bubble at the bottom of your screen. Okay, thank you for coming to our webinar, or the black toolbar. To listen to the audio, please make sure your computer or headphone speakers are turned on and the volume is adjusted. You will be muted during the session and will not be able to share your screen. To exit or change to full screen speaker or gallery view, click on the top right button or view options from the drop-down menu. Over to you.
So good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Dee Williams. I'm one of the PIAC co-chairs at Toronto District School Board, the Parent Involvement Advisory Committee. And I'd just like to welcome you all to our session today and just begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. So we just want to bring to your attention some of our expectations with regard to the conversation. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis. Thank you. The beauties of Zoom and the online world. So we just want to be sure that everyone feels welcome. We have a safe space here, and the conversation agreement that we all come to the space with is that we stay engaged. So I think, Margaret, I've done the land acknowledgement. Did you want me to go to the next slide? So we are in a safe space here where we are looking forward to an engaging conversation. We want to stay engaged, emotionally, intelligently, socially involved in the dialogue. And we understand these are difficult conversations. Experiencing discomfort is a norm. We acknowledge that discomfort is inevitable, especially in dialogues about race, and that participants make a commitment to bring issues into the open. It is not talking about these issues that creates divisiveness, and the divisiveness already exists in society and in our schools. It is through the dialogue, such as what we're going to be having today.
And I'll take on this piece, Dee, just to ensure that all our participants, whether you are on Zoom or streaming with us with YouTube, that we ask that as we move through this conversation, that we recognize each of us are at different places in this dialogue. And because we're at different places in this dialogue and we're all entering into this space together, that many of us may be very comfortable, others may be in discomfort. What we've learned in education, that the way that we actually move through challenging conversations, particularly ones around race, is give ourselves the opportunity to sit in our discomfort. And we sit in our discomfort by just enabling our bodies and opening our minds to the possibility that just a moment of that discomfort will enable us to begin to better hear and understand the various issues and ideas that are being presented, and provide us the opportunity to give our body and our brains the opportunity to make that transition. And if you'd go to the next slide for me, Margaret, please. And you'll see this wonderful slide that I love, where it just speaks of what happens to us when we feel a discomfort. You will know something in your body will tell you of that discomfort. You will notice it. Our natural tendency when we sense something different or new, or something that we don't know or afraid of, we tend to resist. But if we walk ourselves through it, what will happen is eventually our bodies and our minds will eventually relax, and we recognize that we're going to be okay. And as we just move through this space, what will begin to happen is that your body will shift, you'll shift, and you'll be able to stay in the space, but also remain open-minded to hearing the various perspectives that may differ from your own. Because once we get to that place of sitting in our discomfort, there's usually an aha moment that eventually comes from it. Thank you, Dee. So I will now turn it over to our Associate Director, Curtis Ennis, just to bring greetings. And then Curtis will be turning it over to Trustee Doyle to do so, to also bring greetings.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and good morning, everyone. I am truly excited to be here with you this morning to learn how we can talk to our children about race. This is such an important conversation. I am just excited about the possibility that this brings hope for us in our world, because sometimes when I see what is happening in our world, I get a little bit frustrated and I get a little bit uncomfortable about what's going on in our world with our adults. So I think when we start with our children, I think that brings tremendous amount of hope. And this will help us as parents and as caregivers and adults how to speak with our children about race. I think will create a better space and a better world for all of us in the future. So I am so excited about this journey and look forward to being with you. So thanks once again to Michelle and all the organizers, and from our director, interim director, Karen Faulkner, and all the senior team of the Toronto District School Board. We support you in this great work, and we look forward to what this unfolds. Thank you. Over to Trustee Doyle.
Good morning, everyone. I am Trustee Doyle. I'm from Ward 14, Dunn Valley East, and I am also the trustee liaison for our Parent Involvement Advisory Committee, and a former member of that committee. So I've been very passionate about parent engagement for a long time, and I'm very happy to be here with everyone. I wanted to welcome you all. This is the first in a series of conversations that the Parent Involvement Advisory Committee and the Parent and Community Engagement Office have set up for us this year. It's also just one of a number of initiatives that they are taking in order to expand on parent engagement and connections with our community and families. Some of this is being done through funding through the Parent Reaching Out grant that comes from the ministry. So I'd like to thank the ministry for continuing that funding. And we hope to see continued support for that. I want to give a big shout out to PIAC and the PCO for putting on this series, and especially for today's talk, for pushing us outside our comfort zone to deal with some really, really important work, and giving us the information and resources and time to discuss this not only with ourselves, but this particular talk, teaching us how to have a conversation with our children. So thank you again, also to our keynote speaker, Erin Winkler. Thank you for that. And I will pass the floor back to our PIAC co-chair so that they can introduce her.
Thank you so much, Trustee Doyle, for those wonderful words, and Associate Director Ennis as well. I have the pleasure and honor of welcoming our keynote speaker today. My name is Felicia Cito-Lau, and I'm the other co-chair of PIAC, Parent Involvement Advisory Committee. And like I said, I have the pleasure and honor of welcoming and introducing Dr. Erin Winkler. She's the Associate Professor of African and African Diaspora Studies and Urban Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She's also the author of the book, Learning Race, Learning Place, Shaping Racial Identities and Ideas in African-American childhoods. Today, she will speak on how children understand race and how we as parents can help. I look forward to hearing some tools and learning some tools that I can use to speak with my children on this important but uncomfortable topic. Thank you so much. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I want to thank everyone in attendance because I know it's one thing to think a talk sounds interesting and sign up, but it's another thing on your Saturday morning to really show up and be present for a conversation that can be difficult. So I really thank all of you for being here. I'm just going to share my screen. And can you all see it okay? All right. So today, again, we're going to talk about how children learn about race and how adults can help. So our outcome goals are to get an idea about how ideas about race form in the first place. It can be a little counterintuitive. To learn about and understand why this starts really young and how it affects all of us. And finally, of course, what adults really are interested in is, okay, what does this mean? What can we do? So I promise you, we will get to that, what we can do, but we need to start with a little bit of the science behind, what's going on with children's minds and development so that we can understand those tips and tools about how we should be engaging children around race. So I just want to mention, thank you for that beautiful introduction. Sometimes the first question I get is, aren't you a white woman? And how did you end up in African American and African diaspora studies? And what can you really speak to this issue? And so I just want to mention that I grew up in a Midwestern United States college town. I don't know if you all have heard of it. It's not too far from Ontario, although it's not too far from Windsor. So it's a ways from Toronto, but it's Ann Arbor, Michigan. So it's where the University of Michigan is. And it's a predominantly white college town, more diverse than most Midwestern college towns, but still it was a bit too comfortable in its own sense of being liberal. And so there was a bit of a sense when I was growing up about problems with race exist, but not here. We're liberal and we do a good job. And it was very confusing to me as a child because I saw patterns in the world around me that showed that people were treated very differently based on race, from, reading group placement in elementary school to, which peer groups were followed by police in high school and everything in between. And so I found it very frustrating. It was clear to me that the American rhetoric of a colorblind meritocracy, where everyone can get, as long as they work hard, they can get as far as they'd like in life, that it wasn't really true. It didn't ring true based on what I observed around me, or at least it was more complicated than that. But I didn't feel that adults were really helping me understand those differences. And so when I got to college, I was interested in studying racial inequity. And I was told sociology was the place to do that. But when I began taking coursework, African American studies, which is what it was called at my first institution, was really the place that was doing that kind of work deeply. And that's how I ended up in that discipline. And that's how I ended up studying racial inequity. And as part of racial inequity, that study, I wanted to understand how ideas about race, many of which are racial stereotypes, develop in the first place. How do these come to be? So I want to start our talk together with just 3 truths about racial stereotypes. The first is that not all stereotypes, racial stereotypes, are created equal. And what I mean by that is if I were to ask you right now, don't worry, I won't, but if I were to ask you right now to make a list of all the racial stereotypes of which you've heard, not that you believe, but that you've heard of, about all different racial groups, you would have no trouble making a list for white people, making a list for people of African descent, making a list for people of Asian descent, and so on. So what we would see about these lists, what they have in common is that, they're extensive. There's lists for all groups. And also that they're dehumanizing and inaccurate, but we would also see differences. And one of the differences we would see is that they're quite unequal in terms of their impact on people's life outcomes. So if the stereotype about me as a white person is that I'm have no rhythm and can't dance, or that I'm uptight and think I know it all, this is much less likely to negatively impact my life in terms of health, well-being, education, employment, income, housing, and so on and so forth, than if the stereotypes about my group are that we're immoral, we are unintelligent, we are prone to criminality, our legal status, as citizens is questionable, our language skills are limited, and all these other types of stereotypes that tend to be placed upon, inaccurately placed upon people of color. And so the first thing we want to think about is, yes, stereotypes exist about all groups. Yes, stereotypes are inaccurate and dehumanizing and bad no matter the group, but that we do see inequities in terms of how they impact people's life outcomes. And we tend to see more negative stereotypes about people of African descent, people of Asian descent, Latinx people, and so on. And I want to point out that children see this as well. Children see this through media, through school curricula sometimes, through textbooks sometimes, who's making the important decisions in history in their school curricula, and so on. So this is the first truth around racial stereotypes. The second is that the concept of race itself gets falsely naturalized. And what I mean by this is that ideas about race and about what people are quote unquote like, their strengths, their weaknesses, their likes, their dislikes, really can get into the subconscious in a way that makes them seem like quote unquote common sense. But just like race itself is a really made up concept, ideas about race are also made up concepts. So these are not natural, these ideas, they're not just the way it is. They're made up, and they're made up to benefit those in power. And so we really have to sort of fight against this, what psychologists call implicit bias, that these ideas get sort of falsely naturalized into our subconscious. And as we'll see, this happens from a very young age. So just to exemplify this, I want to share a photo with you. I know this is an older photo, it's from 2005, but it illustrates beautifully part of this. And so this is from the day after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, Louisiana, in the United States. The levees have broken. And so these are newspaper photos and captions from the United States. And they show two sets of people in the exact same place, engaging in the exact same behavior for the exact same reasons, we can presume. They've stayed in New Orleans, the levees broke, they've become completely flooded, they need food and drink, they cannot go to the store and pay for food and drink. And so they go to the store and they take the food and the drink that they need. And yet you can see in the caption that the person who appears to be of African descent is described as looting a grocery store, whereas the people who appear to be white are described as finding bread and soda. So this is just one example of, it's hard to tell here whether it's the chicken and the egg, I think it might, or the egg, I think it might be both, of how these subconscious ideas in which Black and brown people are othered, criminalized, not given the benefit of the doubt, and white people are, given the benefit of the doubt. That both the origin of these kinds of ideas, because we get bombarded with these kinds of images via media, political speech, schools and curricula and other places, but also they could be the result of that kind of subconscious bias. I don't know the authors of these captions, so I don't know whether a subconscious bias was at play or a conscious bias, but I think it's highly likely. So not all stereotypes are created equal. Race and ideas about race get falsely naturalized into the subconscious. And finally, the third point and final point I want to make about racial stereotypes is that they're not true. Often my students try to push back with me that, oh, well, all stereotypes are based in truth. But in fact, what psychologists show us is they're not based in reality. They're based in perceivers' beliefs. Now, this is academic talk here. Psychologists call people perceivers. But really what it means is that once we believe something, even subconsciously, right? If those ideas get into the subconscious, like we talked about in point number 2, once we believe it, we look for it. And what happens when you look for something? You find it. So our brain is doing 2 really tricky things here. First, it takes all of these messages that we're bombarded with from society, often subtle messages, and it incorporates them into our subconscious. And then second, our brains are really the most comfortable when the experiences we have fit into our existing set of beliefs, our existing worldview. And so what our brains will do is when we witness something that confirms our existing belief system, our existing stereotypes, we say, aha, see, I knew they were like that. But when we encounter someone who doesn't fit that stereotype, why doesn't that shift our worldview? Why doesn't that make us change our ideas? This is something called confirmation bias, where our brain is likely to just explain away those people who don't fit the stereotypes as exceptions to the rule. And so those 2 things, both implicit bias and confirmation bias, are at play and make us think that these stereotypes are true, or we might not actually consciously believe they're true, but research shows that once they get into our subconscious, they actually affect our decisions and our behavior, even if we do not consciously believe them. But these racial stereotypes and implicit biases, they have to come from somewhere. We're not just born with them already in our brains. So how do these beliefs begin? How young do you think we have to go, researchers have to go to really understand when children first begin thinking about race? Well, research shows, and stick with me here, don't turn away from me on this very first point. Research shows that infants actually categorize people by race by 3 to 6 months of age. Now, I don't want to lose you here. Categorization is not the same as racism. We're not saying that infants are bigots. And also the other question people often ask here is, how the heck do you know what a 3-month-old is thinking about race? So the researchers who do this work, initially in the 1990s, the youngest they tested was 6 months. And then in the early 2000s, researchers went younger. And so that's why the range here says 3 to 6 months, because researchers have found this consistently in infants by 3 months. And they do this with nonverbal tests of how long infants gaze at a new face, a face of someone they don't know, who's the same race as a primary caregiver versus someone who's a different race than one of their primary caregivers. And so this is how researchers know that infants are categorizing people by what we would call race. Obviously, 3-month-olds don't have a sophisticated concept of race as a social construct, but that infants are beginning to categorize by 3 to 6 months. But categorization is not the same as stereotyping. And so researchers have found that it's actually when 2-year-olds will start using racial categories to reason about people's behaviors, but still not necessarily along the line of existing stereotypes. And so this kind of research gives young children scenarios, and asks them, why do you think this person behaved in this way? And one of the things that research shows that children will raise, in addition to other characteristics of the person, is skin color. I do want to be clear here that I'm not equating skin color and race. Our social and political concepts of race are much more complex than skin color. But again, young children, toddlers, are not engaging that complex notion of race. They're more thinking along the line of skin color. So, but again, this reasoning does not necessarily reflect societal stereotypes in thinking. It's just that we understand that kids start to see this as a potentially significant category, socially organizing category for behavior. And I'll explain more of that in a moment. And then finally, research shows that 3 to 5-year-olds will begin to express bias based on race. And I'm going to go a little bit more into a study about this in 2 slides in the future. So if that doesn't sound quite right to you, stick with me for a minute. Now, to be very clear, I'm not saying again that toddlers or preschoolers, young children are hateful, racist, bigots. Again, this is not about this kind of intentional or hateful bias. So what is it about? Well, we think it's about two different sets of things. The first is internal or cognitive development factors. So the very unique things that are going on with young children's brains. And then the second set of factors are societal factors, so external factors to the child. So let's talk about both. First, internal factors. For these younger children, their brains are still developing. And so one consequence of their immature cognitive structures is that they have trouble categorizing people by multiple dimensions at once. And this leads to something that researchers call transductive reasoning, meaning if people are alike in one way, they're alike in other ways. And so an example of this might be a child saying, I have light skin and I'm nice. Mommy has light skin and she's nice, so light skinned people are nice. Or even having light skin makes people nice. I have brown skin and I'm, smart, so brown skin makes people smart. So this is something that really is a function of what's going on with their cognitive structures and having trouble categorizing people using multiple dimensions at once. But what this doesn't explain is why, if we were just saying it was this internal factor that would cause what we call in-group bias towards one's own group, we would expect to also see children, having bias based on things like height or left-handedness or whether or not someone wears glasses. And yet we don't tend to see the same kinds of strong biases based on those kinds of categories as we do for skin color in young children. So why race? Why not height or glasses wearing or left-handedness? This is where those external factors, those societal factors come into play. And what researchers have found is that society tells children that race is a social category of significance. And then children will attach meaning to this category on their own, even if adults do not tell them to do so. So what this means is that when the child observes the world around them, they're likely to see that people in their neighborhood, some wear glasses and some don't, or their teachers at school, some wear glasses and some don't, or the people in the doctor's office, some wear glasses and some don't. It doesn't seem to determine who lives where, who has what kinds of occupation, who is in positions of power, who's the most desirable in their fairy tale, films or books or so on. And so glasses wearing doesn't seem to be what we would call as adults a category of social significance. But they're seeing now skin color does seem to be something that seems to see how families are grouped, maybe neighborhoods are grouped, maybe jobs are grouped, maybe power is grouped in terms of what they're learning in school, what they're experiencing in their world, maybe how admiration is grouped based on what they're seeing in media, and so on. And so, kids are really curious. The world is their cognitive puzzle there, and I'm quoting some scholars, Patterson and Bigler there. The world is their cognitive puzzle. They want to know the rules. They want to know why things are happening. And so when they see these patterns in the world around them, if adults do not explain them to them, why those patterns exist, they tend to attach meaning on their own. And so those same scholars I just cited, Patterson and Bigler, argue that a seemingly innocuous statement like, "Good morning, boys and girls," left on its own, can lead children to make presumptions about, girls and boys, because they are learning, oh, gender is a category of social significance. So even if adults don't, and I'm going to use some examples from the researchers, even if adults don't say girls are smarters or only men can be president of the United States, those are examples from the researchers, that kids come up with those on their own because they're trying to understand this organizing category, this category of social significance. And so when they see these patterns, they often infer that their norms or rules, that the patterns are earned, and sometimes that they've been caused by, inherent differences between people. And again, this is not saying that children are, intentionally, bigoted. This is more about their noticing the world and trying to figure out what is going on in the world. And partially it's about adult silence. They're observing the adult silence. Adults don't want to talk about this. And so they're trying to figure it out on their own. So I want to give you an example here of how this, what we call in-group bias or bias towards one's own group, that is sort of, I don't want to say natural, but the cognitive structures that transductive reasoning for young children can push them in that way, how that comes together with societal norms. And I want to show you a study. I want to talk about a study from scholars Katz and Kofkin. They followed a group of 200 children, roughly half of whom were African American and roughly half of whom were white in the United States. And they followed them from age 6 months to age 6.5. So it was a very significant longitudinal study. Just talking about their ideas here about race. At 2.5 years old, the children in both of the racial groups studied showed an in-group bias. And the way this was measured in the study was simply the children were shown photos of children they didn't know, and they were asked, who would you like to play with? And so at 2.5 years, most of the children, most of the white children and most of the African American children chose a same race face out of that group of photos. However, just 6 months later, at 3 years old, a significant majority of both the white children and the African American children were showing a pro-white bias, meaning now not only the white children, but also the African American children were choosing a white potential playmate. At 5 years, that pro-white bias held, but it had decreased slightly for African American children. Now, this study, which was done in the late 90s, has been replicated multiple times. Oops, sorry about my animation there. It has been replicated multiple times. So I wanted to give you a non-US study here. Another one done in 2011 in suburban London, England, found similar things. So scholars don't think this was a one-off sort of specific to this place or this time of this initial study. So, and also the reason scholars think societal norms are coming in here really is that white children in these studies rarely show anything other than pro-white bias. So what scholars think is happening here is that initially we're seeing that transductive reasoning in play. With the 2.5-year-olds, they're thinking, hey, I look like this and I'm a fun friend. So this person who has the same skin color will also be a fun friend. But what we think is happening at this 3-year-old, when we start seeing this pro-white bias, is that these messages from society are getting in. So society is priming us from bias, and it's getting in quite early. Children are seeing these patterns in their storybooks, in their cartoons, in their, the history they're being taught at school, in who has what kinds of jobs, in, things they see in neighborhoods and so on. And so society is priming us for this bias. It's getting in, and it's getting in subtle and not so subtle ways quite early. And then, what happens over time as we become adults is that bias reinforces inequity in society. Meaning, and I'll use an example here from the United States, if we are bombarded with notions and images from birth that suggest that Black men are prone to criminality, then when we see the racialized inequity of the United States of just mass incarceration, unparalleled in the world of people of African descent, that implicit bias can trick our brains into thinking it's justified, that racist inequity is justified. And so this works in a secular manner. But again, in terms of children, that bias is getting in quite early. And so that's why we see that switch from 2.5 to 3 between the in-group bias switching towards a pro-white bias. Now, I do want to mention that we talked about how it was decreasing in that study by age 5 for the African-American children. And the reason researchers think we see this, of course, and I'm sure the parents of color on this call are not surprised by this, is that families of African descended families, Asian descended families, Native families, Latino families are working against this, right? They know that this societal bias exists, and they're working to try to counter this in their children's thinking. So this is an old quote. I wouldn't use the term ethnic minority today, but I wanted to quote these authors. This practice is something that psychologists call racial socialization, and the definition is broadly, strategies that parents use to rear competent and effective children in a society that's really stratified by race and, racist in many ways against themselves and their children. And so this is something, that families of color are forced to do in many ways in order for their children to survive and thrive. However, many studies, including the ones cited here, find that parents don't actually begin this until their children are a bit older, often 9 to 12, at least talking to them about bias, racial bias. And so the reason for this is usually parents do not want to damage their children. Of course, they want them to maintain their innocence, let them be kids, not scare them or make them feel like victims. And research does show that African descended, Latinx, Asian American, and Native American families are more likely than white parents to talk about racial identity and culture with their very young children. So that happens very young, much before 9. The thing that doesn't happen so much until 9, roughly, is the average in families of color, and often doesn't happen at all in white families, is talking about those racial inequities, helping their kids understand racism, or at least these differences that they're seeing in the patterns in the world around them. And again, it's understandable. Families want to help their children in a way that is not scary and that really buoys them. But what we know is that children are already seeing these patterns in the world around them. And they are making presumptions in the face of adult silence, helping them understand why these patterns exist, that they exist because of unfairness and not because they're earned. We do see children, they want to solve that cognitive puzzle, they want to know the rules, and it appears that in absence of adults helping them understand these patterns of inequity, they are in fact interpreting them in many ways as earned or deserved, and therefore internalizing them in some ways. I don't want to make it sound simple. This does not mean that children of color hate themselves. This is not what I'm saying. This racial pride, identity, culture focus certainly counters that, but more that children are looking at the patterns in the world around them, trying to understand them. Those patterns seem to privilege whiteness, and trying to understand why those patterns exist. And so this is why silence backfires, adult silence backfires. Children's ideas are forming early. Societal messages are already getting in. So adults, we want to protect children, and that's why we tend to not talk about these things with young children. But the messages are getting in. Children are observing patterns in the world around them, and they're trying to solve that cognitive puzzle. And they often presume that these are rules or earned unless they're taught otherwise. Now, this is for young children. I know many of you have older children, and so this is really about how these ideas first come into play. But don't worry, the tips will also be talking about how this plays out with older children. And I'm happy to answer questions about that as well. Now, the tendency for school curricula is to teach primarily about racism in the past. Hopefully this is not true in the Toronto school district, but it tends to be true that when children are formally being taught about racism, it's in the past. And this counterintuitively actually reinforces prejudice in children. It's not adults' intent, but what it tends to be is that the takeaway message for children is, this used to be a big problem. thank goodness, in the United States, it would be like, thank goodness Martin Luther King took care of it, or thank goodness Rosa Parks took care of it. But either way, it's that, thank goodness we've moved past this and that now we're all equal. And the outcome for children is they tend to think of like, okay, we used to be unequal, now it's fixed, and now we're all equal. And so when children see inequities in the world around them, although this is an adult's intent, it can be that they think now those are earned because those problems have been solved. And so when we only teach about racism in the past, it actually tends to increase racism in children or prejudice in children. Also, it can be difficult for children to recognize how racism manifests itself today if they're only taught about historical forms. So if they're only taught about enslavement, or if they're only taught about public lynchings or things like this, then, or they're only taught about, fire hoses being turned on children or whatever it is, then that is what they recognize as racism. And again, when we talk about implicit bias and racial inequities today, it's not necessarily so open, obvious, or even intentional. And so this is another reason why this can reinforce prejudice in children if they can't understand or recognize how racism manifests today. So what can we do? I'm just going to take a sip of water. Excuse me. I focused disproportionately on young children so far, both so that we can understand the origins of racial thinking, and because adults tend to struggle more with the idea of how to talk with young children about this. However, the tips I'm going to give now will apply to children of all ages, and it's just going to be a matter of adjusting for the age, the cognitive development of the child in your life. And also, these tips will have to be tailored to the child's specific situation, their racial identity, the racialized context of their neighborhood, their school, their family. But I do think that these 7 broad tips are tips that can be adjusted for any of the children in your lives. And if you have specific questions about that or how to do that, we can also talk about that in the Q&A. And I do want to say that I will also give a resource sheet that I hope the district will be able to share with you, places where you can do additional reading and find some great additional resources that will be more specific for the children, the situation faced by the specific children in your lives. So my 7 tips. The first one, of course, is we have to work on ourselves. I promise you, I know that seems like a little bit of a cheat since it's not about children. I promise you the other 6 are specifically about children, but I do think this is really, it has to be the first step. And the reason for that is that if we do not understand or feel comfortable talking about these issues with our peers of our same age, it's going to be very, very, very difficult to talk with young children or even older children in age appropriate ways. And so the first thing we have to do is to get comfortable talking about this with other adults. We also have to educate ourselves, which I know can feel like a big task, but it's something that we can do in small pieces if we commit to it over time. I'll just give you one example of a woman, a white woman asked me once, she wanted to know, I think she had a 7-year-old son, roughly that age, and he had said, why are Black people poor? And she wanted to know how to respond to that. And the first thing I wanted to do is make sure you problematize this notion that all people of African descent are poor. Of course, that's not true. But if what your child is noticing is in a 7-year-old way is the disproportionate, racialized wealth gap in the United States, it's tremendous. How would you? I said to her, well, how would you explain it to me? And she didn't know. She didn't know like why did this wealth gap exist, or how to really talk about it. Why did poverty disproportionately affect Black and brown people in the United States? And so this wasn't her fault in the sense of our public school system was not teaching these kinds of things when she was growing up, or I would say enough now. But it is our responsibility to commit to at least doing some of this learning. So again, it can feel overwhelming just to try to know everything overnight, and you don't need to know everything. And I'll talk about that too, about what to do when we feel like we don't know an answer to a child's question. But we do need to work on ourselves first, making this, concerted, ongoing effort, practicing, talking about this, and learning about it for ourselves. Okay, now on to the tips that are really about children. So number 2 is to normalize anti-racist talk. So once we start, we want to make sure, and for many of you, I know number 1, you've already done that work and you're doing that work all the time. So that's great. Once we've normalized talking about race and racism with adults, we also need to make sure that we're normalized talking about race, racism, racial identity, racial inequity with kids and young people. We need to avoid silence. I think we've talked about why silence is a problem, both because it means that children do not understand why these racialized patterns are existing and they're attaching meaning on their own. But it also teaches them that actually it's not cool to talk about this stuff. That's not okay to talk about it, which will often ironically leads adults to think that kids are colorblind because they say, oh, she didn't talk about it, or oh, she was pointing out her friend on the playground and she talked about the color of her shirt, or the length of her hair, but she didn't mention her skin color. And adults often think this is a sign that their child doesn't notice race, but really it's more of a sign that they know that adults don't want you to notice race or talk about race. We also want to avoid using colorblind language. So sometimes a child will ask about race. An example that Beverly Tatum uses in her book that I can share with you is about a young child in a grocery store, a young white child in a grocery store who sees a person of African descent and says, why is their skin dirty? And the parent uses colorblind language. So they shush the child, or sometimes parents will just say things like, we don't want to make her sad. We don't want to hurt other people's feelings. We want to be nice, these kinds of things that didn't actually address, the racialized part of the child's question. And so again, what this does, it doesn't teach kids that mom doesn't care about race or that race doesn't matter. It teaches kids that mom seems to be really uncomfortable when I bring up things about race. And so again, we want to show kids that it's fine. And research shows actually that parents are quite comfortable talking about gender openly and gender stereotypes and gender inequity with young children, but not to the same level with race and racial inequity. Also, we don't just, I know I gave an example of a child bringing it up and how we respond, but we don't want to just wait for the children to bring these issues up, because we want to show for them, that these are important things to talk about, that we notice them, that we're concerned about them as well. So we want to bring these up and address them directly. And also, we want to use the concept of fairness to help. So if you have children in your life, you know that they are very, very attuned to what is fair and what is not fair, and they will let you know. And this is a great quality of children and young people, and it's something that we can use here. So one mistake that adults often make when kids do hear about incidents of racism, for example, adults tend to use language that can make it be about a sick individual, a bad person. And the message for kids can be that this is sort of an outlier issue that only has to do with sick people, as opposed to sort of a set of societal unfairnesses that we need to address. And so you want to help kids understand that these patterns are because of unfairness. Now I'll get to that in a minute, because I'll get to it. The next step is going to be very important, because we don't want to scare children. But it's important when they're seeing these patterns in the world around them that they know that they're not just one-off anomalies, and also that they're not earned or deserved. These patterns of inequity are not things that are natural or the way it's supposed to be or deserved. And so this is why we really want to use the concept of group fairness. So I want to read you a quote from Deborah Van Osdale and Joe Fagan. They wrote a book about racial understandings in preschool age children, and they give this advice. Talk about the fact that the social world we live in is often unfair to people of color simply because they are people of color, and that persisting racial, ethnic inequalities are unjust and morally wrong. Make it clear that racial ethnic prejudice and discrimination are part of a larger society that needs reform and not just something individuals do. Now, two things you might be saying. One, how do I do that with my kids? So we'll get to that. And then two, you might be saying like, gosh, that's a lot of heaviness to place on a young child. So I'll get to that in a moment. But first, I want to give you an example here. I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's a highly segregated city, which is not unusual for the Midwestern United States, unfortunately. And a white mother of a white child who was 4 years old at the time asked me a question. They started their day on the east side of Milwaukee, which means on the shores of Lake Michigan. So this is a desirable part, of course, anywhere to live right on the shore on the water is desirable. And so even though the city is like roughly 40% white, roughly 40% African American, roughly 14% Latino, and roughly 5% Asian and 1% Native American, right along the shore, it's overwhelmingly white. And so they started the day in this fancier, predominantly white neighborhood. There was a brand new shiny Whole Foods market at the time. They went in and got some food. And then they drove through a major east-west thoroughfare called North Avenue that goes all the way out to the western suburbs, but goes through an overwhelmingly African-American neighborhood. And her child asked during the drive something like, why don't brown people have Whole Foods, or why don't brown people have groceries? Something along these lines. So here's a great example where she could use the concept of fairness to help. Did he think it was fair that people with light skin should have more and better access to good and yummy and healthy food than people with brown skin? Of course, he did not think this was fair. So here's a way she could help him understand that this pattern isn't because people don't want or deserve food, and that it's tied to unfairness. But safety is very important. So this especially for Black and brown children, to be told, oh, the world is unfair against you, right, could be highly, highly damaging or traumatizing. And so what we want to do always is help kids understand. We do want to help them understand when they see those patterns, those are because of unfairness, because we know that kids are internalizing them when they don't get these explanations as earned or deserved. But we must always couple this talk about fairness with empowerment. And so empowerment tools so that they know, you know what, I'm glad that you noticed that's unfair, and other people know that's unfair too, and they're working to fight against it. So we want to actively seek out people in our community who, and hopefully we are already among them, but even if we're not, who's already working to change this unfairness. Now, if we're talking about young kids, I don't want to get too wonky with you about cognitive development, but young kids, they need concrete experiences. If your kids are 12, 13 or older, you could talk to them in more abstract ways about people who are doing things without them actually seeing and feeling and touching it. Although it's, concrete examples are great for older kids too. But with younger children, they need to see it, they need to feel it, they need to touch it. And so we want to show and involve kids. So in the example I just gave you, this mother could say to her child, Miss Venus Williams of Alice's Garden here in the neighborhood also believes that it's unfair that people don't have access to fresh and healthy food. And can we go and meet her and hear from her about what she's doing and help weed the garden? Or that's just one example, of ways in which there's people in our community who don't think this is fair either, and they're working on it. And so this is an important way to empower children And also make sure that you think about, now, how are we going to be part of this work? And this is part of that. This is a societal responsibility. This isn't about, you know, individual people being mean or nice. This is about society working to change things. The fourth point is that it's really important to connect the past with the present. So as I mentioned, when we focus on racism in the past only, this actually increases racial bias for children. And so we need to help explain how racism from the past still affects us in the present. And so when you see something happen in the current moment, try to help children understand where it came from and why it's a problem. So an example I could use that I know is an issue in both the United States and Canada in very public ways is the issue of blackface. And so let's say a child says, you know, I put green makeup on my face to be the Incredible Hulk for Halloween and nobody said it was wrong. So how come, you know, this kid over here can't put brown makeup on his face to be this famous person he admires? And so here's something where we could just help children understand. You know, a long time ago, white people used to put brown makeup on. It was called blackface, and they did it to make fun of people of African descent. And even worse, they did it to try to make it seem like people of African descent weren't as human as everybody else, and that they even maybe didn't deserve to be free. And this was wrong, and it caused a lot of inequalities and unfairness. Remember that unfairness we talked about? This was part of that unfairness. And so even today, it's not okay when people do this, because we have to remember what has been the effect of that. When people did that a long time ago, before mom was born, you know, before your grandparents were born, it was meant to hurt people of African descent and make us seem like they were not human. And we still see today some people acting like Black lives don't matter. And so we want to make sure that we are showing that Black lives matter, and we would not do something like that. And this is why your Hulk makeup is not the same as this person putting brown makeup on their face. So even with young children, you can help them understand how and why racism in the past still affects us in the present. Also, again, like I mentioned, children need to be able to recognize problems in order to address them. Any of us need to be able to recognize and name problems in order to be able to address them. And so if we can only recognize what racism looked like in the past, we can't recognize and fight against how racism manifests itself today. Some of that is still very open and obvious and looks a lot like racism in the past, but a lot of it looks quite different. It's more subtle. It might not even be intentional. And so that's important as well. Now, one question I often get is, okay, how do I help a really young child understand this sort of past effect? I can't say to young children like, well, institutional racism has been built into the home loan because, home loan process because of federal government policies, right? You've lost a 4-year-old there, and you've probably even lost an 8-year-old there. But even with young children, there's ways we can do this. So I like to use what I call a spiderweb activity, where you give a group of children, they each get their own, ball of yarn or ball of string. And you ask them, you give them an empty room and you say, okay, I want to see you make a spider web. And they run around the room and they go over and under and they all get tangled up their strings. And when their ball of string is exhausted, you say, great, you made an excellent spider web. Now let's untangle it. Well, they start working on untangling it and they see that untangling it is a lot more difficult than tangling it up in the first place. And that's when you can say, you remember that unfairness that we talked about? It was tangled up before I was born. It was tangled up before your grandparents were born. It was even tangled up before your grandparents' grandparents were born, which is like ancient history to them. They can't even conceptualize that, right? And you say, but we've learned about a lot of people who have done some untangling. And you can name some historical figures they've learned about in school. She did some untangling, they did some untangling. But just like our spider web, untangling this unfairness It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort. And so we are still untangling today. And remember, we went down to, this urban farm and met Miss Venus Williams, and she helped us out, for example, in that example I gave before. She's doing a lot of untangling. And what are the ways that we can do some untangling in our everyday lives? So even with little kids, you can help them understand this effect of the past, so that they don't think of it separate or gone. Now, the only downside of the spiderweb activity is they might come to you and say, well, Mom, I finished untangling, so we've solved racism. And that's when you can just say, well, unfortunately, that unfairness we talked about, it's even more tangled up than our spiderweb. And so that's why we have to still work it on untangling. Okay, we're getting there. Thank you for your patience. The fifth tip, of course, is to model. So the truth is, we are teaching children about race all the time, even when we're not talking about it. So sometimes I think we have the notion that if we're not speaking about it, we're not teaching about it. And that's why I try to avoid in titles of my talks. Sometimes people want to say how to talk to children about race, and talking is important, but I always want to use the broader term teach, because we teach in many more ways than just, talking, than just verbal messages. So think about what choices you're making about their environments and your environments. So who are they seeing moving around in different kinds in their world every day, whether it's home, whether it's school, whether it's a religious institution or a community, whether it's their physician's office or their grocery store or whatever it is. What are they seeing, and might you need to help discuss some of those things with them about what they're seeing. And also, they're witnessing you react to racialized situations when they come up. So how do they see you? Are you, do you clam up? Do you shut down? Do you get angry? How do you respond? And they're watching you. You're modeling for them. Also, if you're sending any of these kinds of do as I say, not as I do messages, kids aren't buying it, right? They are on to that and they're not buying it. And so if you say, it's very important to have a diverse group of friends, but then they see that, you only have people of your own race over to the house, they say maybe it's not that important to her or to him or to them. And so that's why we really want to think about what kinds of messages, the things we're doing, the environments that we're choosing, what kinds of messages our kids might take away from that, even if they're not our intended messages, even if they might be a misconstrued message, how might it be received by the child? And then also, I know I said, before, a lot of times adults, parents, teachers, they're worried about engaging issues of race because they're worried about not having the right answer, or not knowing the answer, or saying something wrong and making things worse. And so they choose silence. And here is where I want to say, kids are, well, first of all, we've seen why silence is not the right route. But kids, they will understand and respect if you say in the moment, maybe your child asks you something and you don't know how to answer. It's fine to say, I feel frustrated, or I feel upset, or I feel sad, or I feel angry that I don't know the answer to this. And the reason I'm frustrated is because I think I should have learned about this in school. And I think the reason I didn't learn about it is because of some of that unfairness we talked about before. And so I really want to learn about this. I'm glad you asked me, and let's learn about it together. So you're modeling for them a respectful engagement and a brave engagement with these kinds of issues. It's important to help kids process and prepare. And so we want to help children process their feelings about racial inequity. So talk with your child about how they felt, if they experienced or witnessed some of this kinds of racial inequity, racism, some of this unracialized unfairness. You can talk to them about how you felt when it happened to you, or when you witnessed it, and help them think about how they might react, respond, engage when they witness or experience things like this in the future. And that is up to you as the parent, of course. You know your child and you know how you want them to respond or engage or not engage, but But even just the process of talking to them and helping them prepare, regardless of you know, how, you know, what you tell them to do, is very helpful in this. So you want to help them think about strategies that they can use in their everyday lives. And I'm not trying to be vague here, but this will really depend on your own child and their age, their racial identity, their school environment, their home environment. And so I'm happy to answer sort of things more specifically in Q&A, but it's just important to be doing this kind of processing with them. The emotional side, essentially, you know, there's an intellectual side to understanding race and racism, but there's really an emotional side. Just as our presenters today started with talking to us about that emotional side, but we want to also talk with our kids about that. And I will say that asking questions, my favorite question to have in your back pocket for kids, and honestly, sometimes for adults too, this can be useful, but just this question, what makes you say that? So if a child says something, and it sounds to you like maybe a racialized idea, maybe a bias, just asking, you know, what makes you say that? What makes you think that? Or that's interesting. How do you come to that idea? Because this will really help you understand their thinking. And sometimes as adults, we misunderstand a child's thinking. So I'll tell you an example about a young Latino boy who had told his parents that he wanted to be white. And his parents were super upset because they had been teaching him racial and ethnic pride, you know, his racial identity. They really reinforced this at home. And so they were devastated, understandably, that their young child would say this. But using the what makes you say that question, it turns out his thinking, not surprising cognitively for a child of his age, was that he wanted to be a physician. And he had only ever seen white physicians. And so his thinking at the time was, okay, well, to be a doctor, you have to be white. So I need to be white. That's the first step. And so it wasn't about, you know, hating himself or internalizing, you know, negative messages about his own group. So then once they understood his thought process, then they could address the issue, helping him expose him to people in the medical field that shared his same racial and ethnic heritage, and also maybe talking to him a little bit about some of that tangled up unfairness that might have made it so that he hadn't seen people of his same racial identity as much as he should have in the health field so far. And then the last tip I'll give is a really, really important one, and it works for children and teens of all ages, and it also works no matter their racial environment. I know Toronto's a very racially diverse city, but and school district. Sometimes I engage with people who live in very racially isolated situations, and this can work in those situations too. So this is really to help kids recognize, pick out, and critique racialized messages in the world around them, whether that's in the media, whether that's in the curriculum, although I'm sure that's not the case in Toronto, but in some places it is, whether it's in political speech, whether it's in advertising, whether it's in laws or rules, regulations. Help them to pick out and critique things, patterns. So you want to help them first to recognize patterns. So what doesn't seem quite right here? Why are we seeing the patterns we're seeing? What are those patterns and why are we seeing them? So why am I seeing white characters in movies in all different settings and all different time periods doing all different things? But when I see Native Americans in movies, they're only in one, maybe two different time periods, in one, maybe two different settings, doing the same kinds of things all the time. Why am I seeing those patterns? What would be the reasons behind that? Do you think that's fair? Do you think that's true? Why is the news showing this white young man who's accused of a crime in his cap and gown, but they're showing this African descended young man who's accused of a crime in a mugshot? Why are we seeing this pattern? You know, what could be the reasons behind this? Do you think that's fair? Maybe sometimes I talked with a teenager recently about dress codes. Why is it that the dress code at their high school seems to just, or at their school seems to just mirror whatever in the United States is sort of Black urban fashion at the moment? So they were noticing this racialized, as well as gendered, actually, that girls' bodies seem to be being policed more in the dress code than boys' bodies. So why are we seeing this patterns? And then you can also tie this with that empowerment thing. So let's say the pattern that they're seeing is about the dress code. How can they engage with, the school administration around their concerns around these issues? Or maybe they're noticing patterns in the children's book section at the library. What, can they do, can they make a list of suggestions and take it to the librarians, or do a book drive for their local library? Can they contact the local news about the racialized portrayals they think they see with the graduation photo versus the mugshot, and so on? So again, sort of helping bring in that empowerment piece. And this is important and doable, again, no matter the child's age, racial identity, or local context. So I know I've talked a long time. I'll stop there. Those are my 7 tips, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. So thank you.
Hello, Dr. Winkler. Thank you so much. That was a very interesting talk. I picked up a lot of tips, and I was madly jotting them down as in the background here. We do have a question in the Q&A, and I encourage others, attendees, to please go to the bottom of your screen and click on the Q&A icon and enter in your questions. We have some time. So Dr. Winkler, one of the questions, if I may, one of the questions that came through the Q&A is if you can please speak to how these conversations are differentiated based on children who are racialized, and recognizing that there's racial trauma that Black, Indigenous, and people of color children experience.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I know first I want to speak about language, because I think I know we often use people of color in the United States. We do use racialized, but we also tend to say that white people are racialized as white, that whiteness is so I hope I'm not using confusing language when I have said racialized within the talk. But I'm understanding here that you're asking about people who are African descended, Asian descended, Latinx, and Native. Okay. So of course, again, one thing I want to do here is I don't mean it as a cop-out, but I want to give you an additional resource that I think does an excellent job about this, because of course, I definitely can give you advice, academic-based advice, but obviously based on my own experience, I do not have the experience of parenting children of color. That's not obvious. I guess I shouldn't say that. I could have that experience, but I do not have that experience. And so I do want to tell you about one resource, and then we can talk a bit further. So if it's okay for me to share my screen. Oops, it looks like it's gonna go to Zoom, but what I'd like to, do you see a website right now that's called Embrace Race? Okay, yes, so I want to give a big shout out to Embrace Race. I don't know if you know about it, but I do think there can be an assumption at times, a false assumption, that parents of color already know how to do all of this, and that it's white parents who need to learn how to do this. Now, it's true that, like you're saying, racialized parents are forced to have these kinds of conversations in ways that white parents may never be forced to have them. But that doesn't mean that it's easy for, let's say, an African descended parent to talk to their children about, police violence against African descended people, for example. And so I bring this up because Embrace Race is a fantastic website that recognizes this, centers, not exclusively, but centers racialized experts, and centers the kinds of questions that you're asking here. And so if you look at their resources, you can browse by topic. Here's one right now upcoming that was like managing racial stress for young children. So I think I really want to say, you know, there's specific ones: raising multiracial children, raising Black children, raising healthy Muslim children, raising white children, transracial adoption. And also they have all of their webinars. Let's see. Let's see if I can, I'm just going to look at this one. They have all of their webinars, their resources, their historical webinars. You can go and watch them. So they have articles, webinars, and they have specifically ones that will be helpful to you. So like the one I just mentioned about talking to, again, in the United States, we tend to say Black, not exclusively, but often it's because of the trying to sort of focus on the political nature of how Blackness is constructed in the United States. So supporting kids of color amid racialized violence, supporting Black boys to thrive at school, in my skin, right? So you might, I think, find some very specific things, not Black enough, not Mexican enough. So I really think that this website is excellent for really getting into some of these specific kinds of questions. I'll also point out that the Center for Racial Justice in Education has a whole list of resources for talking to kids about race, racism, and racialized violence. And in there, I really like to share with you a interview by Howard Stevenson. He's or an interview with Howard Stevenson. He's a psychologist with just decades of expertise in this, and he is, I don't want to be incorrect, I think he's somewhere in Pennsylvania, at a university in Pennsylvania. And he talks a lot about this too. And he also talks from not only his academic experience, but his own experience as an African-American man having raised young African-American children. So I'm not sure, did you want to read me the question again? I'm not sure if I answered it.
Certainly. The question was how these conversations are differentiated based on children are racialized, recognizing the racial trauma that BIPOC children experience.
Yes. Okay. So I think part of the issue is really thinking about children's, like we said, that empowerment piece. Because the one hand, if we put off these conversations, which we might want to do to protect our children because of this trauma and also because of the consequences for racialized children, it could be devastating to a sense of self. It could potentially make them feel like, why try, you know, if the world is going to be unfair to me? So it could lead to hopelessness and these kinds of things. And so the empowerment piece is very important. If we don't have the conversations at all, though, which is the other alternative, we do know that these ideas from the society around them of racialized inequity or of privileging whiteness, or that, you know, whiteness is better in some ways, can affect the children. So silence doesn't protect them either. I think the biggest thing to think about is what are the children's, making sure that you focus on safety in an age appropriate way. So I mentioned the book, it's an older book, but it's a good book. Have any of you read this? Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum. I mentioned it earlier when I said the grocery store example of the mother shushing her child. I mentioned that because she, the title of the book is really a question she said she would get a lot from adults. And so that's why she titled the book that. But she goes through different age groups, and there's a chapter on younger children. And she gives specific examples for how to talk to, she's an African-American woman, and she talks about raising her own 2 sons. And she talks about how to talk about traumatic things, like she gives the example of enslavement, talking about this with her own son, in ways that that are age appropriate and protect their safety and well-being, which I think is partially what this question is about, right? For white children, there might be shame involved, but that's not quite the same as, that's not at all the same as fear and trauma, you know, both the generational trauma, the contemporary trauma, and also fear that this will be happening to you or people that you love. And so I really do recommend that book. There's a chapter on the early years, but there's also a chapter on adolescence and adulthood that can answer some of those sort of specific concerns.
Thank you.
So thank you for that, Erin. So I really appreciate the analogy that you gave about the tangled spider web. I think that was like really, it could be like really relevant, especially to younger children, in kind of getting a grasp on the complexity of the discussion. Um, there's a question in the Q&A about how you would discuss with folks that encourage bias and racist views with their children. How do you approach those kinds of conversations?
So adult to adult?
Adult to adult.
Okay.
Yeah, adults who are like encouraging that bias
Yeah.
and those racist views in their children.
So remember when I said I sometimes use that "what makes you say that" question with adults too? I'm bringing that in here, and here's why. What we know, just from those of you who are educators, what we know from the science of teaching and learning, what we know from pedagogical research is people learn best when you start with where they are. Now that can be difficult when you meet them where they are, right? That can be difficult when we're talking about racism because it can feel like a compromise. But the truth is, and everyone has to decide this for themselves and where their boundaries are and all this kind of thing. But the truth is generally when you come in and people tell people that they're racist jerks, it doesn't actually change their minds, okay? And again, I'm not trying to put the emotional labor of changing people's minds on anyone, especially not on people of color. I think it's especially white people's work to do this, especially with other white peers. But the question was about bias, and all different kinds of groups can have, hold various kinds of biases. So this could apply to any group. And what we know from the science of teaching and learning is people meet best when people learn best. You tend to move the needle when you start with their current understandings, where they are now, and then go from there. And so that's why I think that's why I found this "what makes you say that" question to be very useful. If someone says something biased and you know that they're also encouraging that in their children, and you come in and tell them you shouldn't do that, people tend to shut down. Even psychological research shows if you give people facts to show them they're incorrect, this still doesn't change their minds. But if you ask them to explain their own thinking, now that can actually move the needle. So when you hear someone say something biased, it doesn't mean you have to act like you agree. You could definitely show that you don't agree, but you could say, what makes you say that? What brought you to that kind of thinking? And then, first of all, it's moved the burden from you to prove that they're wrong to them to prove that they're right, or to try to show you what their thinking is. And often what happens is then when people start to explain their ideas, you can just begin to poke holes. So I'll tell you about one very unpleasant airplane ride I had where the white man sitting next to me asked me what I did, and I said I was a professor, and he asked me what I taught, and I told him I taught African American studies, and he just started saying all kinds of racist stuff. And one thing he said was something about African American people cheating on food stamps, on food assistance in Wisconsin, the state I live in. And so I said, what makes you say that? How did you come to that thinking? And then he had to explain, well, he'd seen this particular thing in this grocery store, and he'd seen this thing in this other grocery store. And I said, okay, so you've witnessed two, sounds like you've seen this twice. How many people do you think are on food assistance in the state of Wisconsin? And did you know that most people on food assistance are, in the state of Wisconsin are white? And do you think it's possible that, as with anything, most people who engage in it are doing it for the right reason? And, this is just not a perfect example, but as he's talking, I'm just sort of asking questions and, putting some counterfacts in when I think he's maybe got incorrect information. Now, I'm not saying that he left that plane ride having his mind totally changed, but generally the research will tell us that he's more likely to change his mind over time with that kind of engagement than with, basically telling him that he's wrong. Now, again, that's a lot of emotional labor to ask people to do, and everyone has to decide for themselves whether, to what extent you can engage with that at any given moment. But that's my advice in terms of engaging other adults on these kinds of things. And if you have a personal relationship with them, then that, that trust is likely to go a long way, and they're listening to you. But use that question, how did you arrive on that? What makes you say that? And flip it over from you having to have all the information to prove them wrong to their having to explain their own thinking.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Erin. I have another question here in the Q&A. This person's a parent of a white child in the system, in the TDSB. This child's 5 years old, and she's asking if she can get some improvement on her dialogue when she's talking to her child about race. And specifically, she finds it's hard not to talk about people of other skin colors without feeling like I'm making them seem like they are, quote, other, end quote. This person says, I try to talk about how we are all people with feelings, etc., under our skin, but could you maybe give her some suggested dialogue on how she may talk to her child about this?
Yeah, so this is a really important thing for all of us. So I'm trying to get us to be more comfortable talking about race, but there are ways of talking about race that are problematic, that are a problem, that can be othering. I'm just gonna, so the first thing that popped to my mind, and if anyone loved this book, please don't be angry with me, but I remember reading this book called The Time Traveler's Wife. It was probably a few decades ago. But I remember there was a scene where they hadn't talked about the main character's racial identity. They hadn't talked about anyone else's racial identity. And there's a scene in the book where they say the Indian doctor. And I keep waiting for it to be relevant that the doctor is Indian, because perhaps it is relevant, right? We don't need to whisper and pretend, actually Tatum talks in this book about her students saying like, there was a woman and she was black, like it's a secret. So we don't need to pretend we don't know this race. But at the same time, in this context, right, where no one's race gets mentioned, but then the Indian doctor's race gets mentioned, and then it doesn't end up being relevant in the story, this is othering. It is normalizing. I think what was happening in the book was the other characters were presumed to be white. And that was a normalization of whiteness, that people are white, that's the standard or that's the norm. And then, if they are not white, well, I have to mention it. So I don't mean to be libeling that author. This is a memory from a few decades ago, but that's an example here. It's like there are ways in which, depending on how we're noticing or talking about race, we can, in fact, be doing something where we're normalizing especially whiteness, and othering other groups. But we want to remember that noticing race is not a problem, and kids are noticing race. And so I would like to actually show you I'm going to show you a slide. This is what I call my racism equation slide that students sometimes find useful. So I'd like to share it if you don't mind. But kids just noticing race is what we would call categorization. And that in and of itself, that in and of itself is not a problem. So noticing race, okay, sorry, I'm gonna try again. Here we go. Okay, I think this should work. Noticing race in and of itself isn't a problem. And we shouldn't be surprised that kids are. We're teaching young children to categorize colors and animals and shapes, right? We are teaching them to match, and we're teaching them all these things. So we shouldn't be surprised that they're noticing race. It becomes stereotyping, however, when we add to that cultural baggage. And what I mean by that is assumption about what those people are like. And then psychologists say when we add in-group bias, so not only assumption about what people are like, but what my group is like is better than what your group is like, that's when it becomes prejudice. And when we add to that group social power, in other words, which group has the power for their subconscious prejudice to become the way society is set up, to be built into curriculum and law and so on and so forth, that's when it really becomes this more structural racism. And so we really want to think about this equation when we're talking to kids. If we are talking about, noticing differences, valuing differences, that kind of thing, and contributions of various groups, as long as we're not getting into this adding assumptions, the cultural baggage, or making it seem like some group is better than other group, then it's not a problem to be talking about or engaging in these conversations about race. And I will say there's another website called, I think you'll still find Embrace Race helpful, but there's one called Raising Race Conscious Children, that really they do some kinds of webinars and videos where parents practice doing these things, like practice having these kinds of conversations that I think could be very helpful.
Okay, great. Thank you for that response, Erin. So the next two questions kind of maybe could be answered together. And it could be a tag team, Erin and Curtis, because they're asking about TDSB. So in recent years, the TDSB has done good work teaching elementary school students about residential schools. Are teachers also discussing current affairs in elementary classes to help ensure that students understand that racism in Canada still exists? Thinking in relation to Dr. Winkler's point on the school curriculum focusing on historical racism. How are we supporting our teachers to engage in discussions on race?
If I may, Dee, I would offer that indeed a lot of our teachers and educators in the Toronto District School Board are talking about the current events in order to deal with issues of race and oppression. Certainly issues around, for example, most recent events around Capitol Hill, that sparked a lot of conversation in many classrooms from, the youngest learners right up to our oldest learners. And that was something that I know was widespread throughout the district. Issues around anti-Semitism that flares, around homophobia, Islamophobia, any current event that happens on a massive scale that is drawn to the attention of most people, I would say becomes a part of the discourse in most classrooms. And that is encouraged. And so I am encouraged by that, to know that that is happening in our classrooms. Indeed, it's not just from a historical perspective, but certainly from a current perspective as well.
Thank you for that, Curtis. And I think the next question segues nicely into that. Can you provide any examples of schools with student bodies of predominantly white or Asian populations who do important work with respect to consciousness raising regarding racial equity, social justice?
I wouldn't want to name any particular school on this panel right now, but I do know that a lot of schools are doing work, and schools that are described by the questioner who may have predominantly white or a predominance of other groups in the school that may not be representative of, let's say, Black students, Indigenous students, Asian students. Those schools are encouraged, and I know are continuing the work, because we recognize that it's not just about the population of your school, that it's about our world, and it's about what happens to us globally as citizens. And so that is the level of consciousness that I know that a lot of our leaders have, and that is permeated throughout many of our schools.
And can I add that I'll just say that research shows that having that administrative institutional support is key. Teachers, like other adults, are scared in some ways, about talking about some of these things, and knowing that they have that institutional support means everything in terms of their being willing to engage in these kinds of things.
Thank you. I think this will be our last question because we're out of time, but we're going to squeeze it in. From YouTube, we have a question. How should a teacher address a situation when a kindergarten child says that they are not allowed to play with a darker skinned child or children because their parents told them not to?
Okay, so this is I'll see if I can this is a very tangled up issue, talking about tangled up. So there's multiple parties to be concerned about here. So in what context is the child saying this? Are they saying it in front of the darker skinned child? So that's something too we need to think about, like who's involved in the conversation. That would not necessarily shape, but it's something that the teacher needs to keep in mind. So for example, I do think it's important to use this "what makes you say that" question, but it may not be appropriate to ask that in front of the darker skinned child, depending on what if something hateful or hurtful is going to come out of the child who said this mouth. We don't want to, again, speaking about trauma for racialized children, we don't want to further traumatize the child. Right. One thing that's very important is that I don't know if this child was specifically white, but we know that no child's learning should happen at the expense of another child. So let's say this a white child asked this. Their learning that this is wrong should not be at the expense or the trauma of the Black child, Asian child, or, you know, darker skinned child in the scenario. So it's always important that we're first making sure that we're not traumatizing other children further in the learning experience of this child who's asked this question. At the same time, it's important for the teacher to model the adult response that this is not acceptable, and it's not acceptable because it's racialized. So we don't want to go into the colorblind language that it's true that we want to be nice to other people. It's true that we don't want to hurt other people's feelings, and it's okay to say all of those things, but not at the expense of ignoring the racialized nature of the attack or of the exclusion. Because again, what we've shown that does is it just teaches kids not that race doesn't matter, but that adults won't talk about it, you know, that it's a really taboo topic. In fact, they see it really does matter. And that's part of the reason why they're engaging with it in their I don't want to say power negotiations, but in many ways, that's what's happening in playgrounds and in classrooms. So it is important for the teacher to talk about, again, take this back to a conversation. Hopefully, let's zoom back that the teacher is going to create an environment in their classroom where they're already having these kinds of conversations about social justice and unfairness and working against this kind of unfairness. And so in that situation, they can say, you know, that you know, this is that kind of unfairness we've been talking about, and it's not acceptable. But it's important to ask the child, what makes you say that? And I'm just saying this because there are examples of things where people will say things like, where white kids have said things like, Black men are scary. And then the what makes you say that conversation gets into, like, they're talking about a ninja character that's dressed in black in a cartoon, which still kids can elide those kinds of symbolic notions of, you know, Black is scary with actual people and skin color. And so I don't want to dismiss the ninja thing as nothing, but it might be a little bit different than what the adult in the situation, whether it's the teacher or the parent, was expecting. And then this is where the institutional support comes into play, because the teacher has to be really clear. You know, teachers don't want to go against what parents say, but if it really is true that a parent, once they engage the parent on this, you know, does have these kinds of racist notions that their child is not allowed to play with dark-skinned people, then if the teacher has that institutional support to say, look at our mission statement for our school. Anti-racism is explicit in our mission statement for our district, and therefore these values are not aligned with our district. And so I'm fully empowered to tell the child, we don't, you know, that's not acceptable here. So I do think that institutional support for the teacher to be engaging in that kind of discussion. I hope that was helpful. It's a very complex issue.
It certainly is, and it was uncomfortable, but it's good to be growing in our discomfort. Thank you. I'd like to invite Michelle Monroe back. Michelle, you're on mute.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Felicia. Dr. Winkler, we extend our thanks and our appreciation for you joining us in TDSB today. We thank you for outlining some key tips for parents, caregivers to begin to think about. So for those who are having this conversation, you've encouraged them to continue the conversation. For those who have not started it, you've outlined clearly why it's important that we start it even when we are not comfortable with it, but also the encouragement for us as the adults or the adults in our children's lives to find a place where we are comfortable to begin. But I also heard you say clearly, sometimes we need to go do our own research. We need to do a little homework. We need to just go to Google and Google it. We can Google how to talk to our kids about race and we'll get multiple resources there. So I want to thank you so much for being with us and providing us with the information. For those who are joining us, please note that we have recorded the session and we will be posting it on our conversation series page, but also on the PCO's YouTube page. For those who are streaming on YouTube, we will be posting it. Please give us a couple days to clean it up and do all the things we need to do to upload it. We know this conversations about race is not an easy one, but we know that it's happening with our children, whether as adults we choose to have it or not. And we're encouraging different forums for this conversation to happen. And I know in our district, I posted in the chat, we have very clear procedures and guidelines for staff about how we're working to create very safe and healthy anti-racist spaces for children and staff and our parent community. So there are links to that on our website. We encourage our staff and parent caregivers to take a look at it. We have clear guidelines around discrimination in our district. So we also encourage parents to be aware of what that looks like and what steps you have the right to take in our district when this occurs. And I also want to encourage you that this was the launch of our conversation series. We have multiple more series upcoming. February 4th, we'll be talking about racialized trauma provided to us by Dr. Charmaine Lane. So we want to talk to racialized parents about what racism can and is doing to racialized children. We want you to know what some of the tips are to how you can pay attention to it, but also what strategies you can be engaging to ensure our children are supported. So stay tuned to our conversation series so you'll be able to follow us because we have some great things coming up. We'll be doing Screenagers 1 and Screenagers 2 coming up in March because we know what's happening online in this era. And we want to be sure as the parent caregivers that we're in those spaces and having the right dialogue. So please stay tuned with the conversation series, but I also know that February we will be launching African Heritage Month in our district. So please stay tuned for that. There'll be a great launch. And so there's so many conversations happening in our district and we encourage it. And we encourage that every parent giver begins to have these conversations. So thank you for joining us on this Saturday. We wish you a wonderful day and look forward to seeing you on February 4th for our next series. A special thanks again, Dr. Winkler. A special thanks, Trustee Doyle, our PIAC co-chairs, Associate Director, and I'm going to extend a special thanks to Margaret and the staff in the PCO who continues to work diligently behind the scenes where nobody sees them to make sure these things can happen. So thanks to everyone and have a wonderful day.